Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm George and I've just been to the Anya cafe, which is a small cafe in Pont Street in Belgravia, and have this really nice selection of quirky fun cakes. And this one is a coffee and walnut cake, and I thought it would be quite fun to paint. I've chose to go with a pink background because it's got a pink tongue, so I think it's quite nice to have some of the background colours picked up in this tongue, and also it just adds to that fun, sort of sweet vibe. Remember to please subscribe to my channel, and let's start painting.
So for those of you watching, this is going to be a real-time painting video, so you'll get to see my entire process from start to finish, and I'll also show you my palette at stages so you can see how I make the different colour mixes. And if you do like to paint, then do feel free to pick up a paintbrush and some paints and follow along the process, and I can guide you step by step. Or if you just want to sit back and relax, and I hope you find this video interesting. So today I'm painting on a canvas panel that I've toned to a neutral grey, and I'm using oil paint. So I find painting on this grey mid-tone is quite helpful, especially at the start of the painting, as when you put the colours down you see them more true to their value and their hue. For example, if I was to paint directly onto a white panel, the colours would look quite dark in comparison to this white panel. Likewise, if you paint on a very warm underlayer, the colours will have a tendency to look cool in relation to this. So working on a neutral mid-tone I find can help the early stages of the painting. So here I'm just using raw umber that I've thinned down with my medium. So I'm trying to get the proportions as accurate as possible, and to do this I'm using a technique known as comparative measurement. So I'm holding my brush up and holding my thumb on my brush and then closing one eye so I can see my brush against the cake, and then I can check the height compared to the width. And what I'm trying to look for, if I can, is two measurements which are the same, which bear the same relationships. This could be the height to the width, or it could be another section within the painting. And by keeping track of these proportional relationships as you paint, it helps you keep the drawing and the size of everything under control and correct in relation to the other areas of the painting. For example, here I found a comparative measurement of the top of the cake to the bottom of the base. From the angle that I'm looking at the cake is the same as the width of the base. And so what I can do is I can check by holding my paintbrush up to the cake, and then on my painting I can do the same thing, holding my paintbrush up and using my thumb to mark the measurement. I can then use my paintbrush as a measuring tool in this fashion to keep control of the proportional relationships within the painting. So with this underdrawing, I'm just trying to get the simple shapes and structure of the cake. I'm not going to go into great detail, as sometimes the problem with going into a lot of detail in an underdrawing is that you can become so attached to the drawing that when it comes down to actually putting down the paint, putting the colour mixes down, it can force you to be quite timid, because in order to create bold brushstrokes you're going to have to lose that underdrawing completely. And if you have a really detailed, nice underdrawing, sometimes you don't want to paint over it and lose it. However, it has to be done, so I like to get the underdrawing done, get everything which is essential in that drawing, and then start going into the colour mixes. I also find it easier to see shapes more accurately once they're filled in with a tone, as it can be quite hard looking at a linear drawing which is blank other than the lines and trying to judge how accurate the shapes are. I often find once you start filling them in, then the shapes will jump out to you. The closer that your painting gets to the object you're painting, the easier it is to compare, and therefore the easier it is to see any mistakes. So I do like to get in to the painting stage quite early. And when I start to work with the colour mixes and put the colours down, I will show you my palette alongside the painting, so that way you can see all the colour decisions that I'm making and the way I'm mixing the colours. As a lot of the painting, especially when it comes to thinking about how to make the colours and the values within the painting, a lot of those decisions are made on the palette, so I will show you my palette alongside the painting shortly. On my palette I've got titanium white, cadmium yellow, yellow ochre, cadmium red, alizarin crimson, raw umber, permanent green, and ultramarine blue. Here I'm mixing the colour for the icing on top of the cake and in between the layers. I'm using titanium white, yellow ochre, and a touch of my raw umber. And now I'm mixing a darker mix for the layers of cake. I'm using raw umber, titanium white, and some yellow ochre, as well as a touch of my cadmium red. And to make these mixes I'm using my palette knife because it gives me a lot more control over the colour of the mix, because I can just pick up as much paint as I want and then mix this in and mix a good amount of paint as well. Sometimes when you try and mix just with your brush, you don't have quite the same amount of control about how much paint you mix, how much paint you can pick up from each mix, and paint will get stored within the brush, which can also cause different colours to mix if the brush isn't completely clean. So using the palette knife I can mix a big pile of paint which I can use for the whole section of the painting, and this means that I don't have to go back and try and mix the exact same mix again, as I have enough of that mix, enough of that colour to paint the whole area. And here I'm mixing a white for the base. However, I'm not going to use pure titanium white. I'm adding a touch of my ultramarine, a touch of my cadmium red into this mix just to make the mix a very slightly purple hue, because there's a lot of pink light getting reflected into it. And also I don't want to work with the lightest light yet. I want to try and keep the very lightest areas for a few select highlights, and in order to give these highlights a real glow, they have to be the brightest sections of the painting, so you don't want anything to really compete with them, otherwise they lose that shine a little bit. So for now I'm making pretty much very close to pure white, just slightly dulled down for the base. And also as I apply the paint, I apply it quite thinly at this stage. That way it's going to be easy for me to paint on top of it if I haven't painted the section in quite the right spot, or if someone has to sit on top of this paint, I can easily paint on top of it without the two layers mixing. And when it comes to painting these colour mixes onto the painting, I first just apply a small bit of paint to a small section of the area I want to paint. That way I can analyze this paint, see if it looks like the right color, if it looks like the right value. Is it too light, is it too dark? As sometimes when you're looking at the paint on the palette, it can look different when you put it down on the painting. But one thing I'm also bearing in mind is that I haven't covered the whole painting yet. So as colors and values are relative things, I won't know for sure whether the value and the color is right until I've painted down the other areas which this section is going to sit next to. For example, at the moment, the light icing may appear to be a bit too dark, but once I paint this darker section of the layers of cake underneath it, I know that this, in contrast, is going to make the icing look lighter. Here I'm painting a warm halftone on the edge of the icing as it turns away from the light. And the reason that this halftone has this warm pinkish hue to it is because as the cake is surrounded by pink, there's a lot of pink light getting reflected. So this halftone is picking up some of that pink light. And also it's darker because it's getting less of the original light source, which is the light on the left hand side. And as it turns away, it gets darker, and this gives the cake and the icing that 3D effect. And then next to this halftone, it then goes into a shadow, and then you get a cast shadow which is sharper on the right hand side where the icing sort of swirls towards the eyes. And here I'm painting in the layers in the middle section of the cake. And at the moment I'm just using these 3 colour mixes that I've made. And I'm also using 3 separate brushes. That way I keep really good control over the colours that I'm putting down on the painting. And as I go and get into more detail, I will start using some brush mixing to make subtler variations within these sections of paint. And here I'm making a dark mix using my raw umber paint, my alizarin crimson and a touch of my ultramarine to paint those dark sections between each layer. This section is facing down, it isn't getting hit by the light, so it's in shadow. So here I'm painting on the googly eyes, and these eyes were actually the thing which drew my attention to this cake. And one thing you'll notice when you go into the Anya Cafe is there's a lot of googly eyes looking at you, and these eyes are actually Anya Hindmarch, who is the founder of the cafe and is a very successful handbag designer. These eyes are sort of her logo, so you'll see them a lot on a lot of her handbags, and definitely if you go around what's known as the Anya Village, which is a series of different shops all owned by Anya Hindmarch, and you'll see a lot of these googly eyes all over the place. I thought this cake really captures the spirit of the Anya Cafe and the Anya brand in general. So I'm starting off by painting the base of the eyes, and I'm not going to paint this dark pupil on quite yet. This is going to be a fun part of the painting that I'm going to save until a bit later. I want to try and cover as much of the painting as I can before I start finishing off those fine details. And here I'm just going to show you my palette, because I'm going to mix the main mixes for the background of the painting. And I'm just going to show you the palette because at the moment there's nothing going on my canvas. So I'm trying to mix a really big amount of paint so that this mix will last me for the rest of the painting. And as I've got quite a big area to cover, I want to mix a good amount of paint, because I know once I get this colour mix right, I don't want to have to try and mix it all again from scratch. So if I can make a big mix, then I can just keep going back to this mix to finish off the painting. And the great thing about oil paint is that this mix will stay wet and usable for the duration of this painting. And what I'm doing is I'm mixing a few subtle variations, so a darker mix for the shadow which the cake is casting, and then a sort of mid-tone and a really light tone, as even throughout this background there is quite a lot of variation of values between this pink background. Some sections further back are a bit darker, other sections which are receiving more of the light are going to be lighter. So I want to have a variety of mixes to be able to pick and choose from as I paint this section. So I do find it is helpful when painting to sometimes stop, take a moment and mix all the mixes that you're going to need to paint, and try and mix a big amount. And sometimes if you've got a small palette, you won't be able to mix a big enough amount of paint, so you'll kind of have to do it section by section. But here I've got enough space to really mix the whole variety of the pink background. I'm just going in with the pink using a filbert brush to start painting around the contour of the cake. And as I paint around this contour, I'm also refining it and trying to make it even more accurate and make it closer and closer to what I see when I look at the cake in real life. Here I'm using a darker, warmer mix which has a redder hue to it to paint the shadows underneath the spoon and also the cast shadow on the right hand side of the cake. Here I'm using a hog bristle filbert brush to cover the background, and as I paint I'm adding subtle shifts in colour temperature and value to the paint mix to add some variety and atmosphere to the background, as I don't want the background to appear as one flat 2D pink wall. So here I'm just starting to refine the shadow on the right hand side of the cake, which is known as a cast shadow, because it's a shadow which is getting cast by the cake, which is blocking the light from the main light source. And when I paint these shadows, I'm trying to be quite specific with the shadow edge, as the shadow edge tells you a lot about the object, and it also makes the light effect seem more realistic. So in general, with a cast shadow, when the shadow starts near the object, the edge of the shadow is quite sharp, and as the shadow gets further away from the object, the edge gets quite a lot softer and less distinct. Here I'm painting this pink tongue which is sticking out from underneath the coffee flavoured icing, and having this pink tongue and the googly eyes was one of the things which attracted me to this cake, because it gives it that really fun, silly, quirky expression, and it just makes it a nice fun cake to look at. So when I was looking through the counter in the Anya cafe, this one really stood out to me. It just felt like the cake had a lot of character. So as much as this is a still life of a cake, it's also a portrait of a cake, and I'm trying to capture the expression which this cake has. I'm trying to get the proportions, the eyes, the tongue, everything in the right position. And I'm also using the same colour that I used in the background to paint the pink tongue. So when I started the painting, before I even set up, I was thinking about how can I create some unity to the scene as a whole. And I thought, because of this pink tongue being the most colourful part of the painting, that it would be nice to have some of this colour in the background, which is why I chose to go for the pink background. And then by connecting the background to the foreground through this little dash of pink from my paintbrush, just really brings a sense of unity to the whole composition. Here I'm painting the shadow which is getting cast on the base of the cake, and it has a really nice purple tone because it's picking up a lot of that pink reflected light from the surrounding areas. Here I'm painting one of the fun bits, which is painting the eyes, and I don't have any black on my palette, so in order to create this dark for the pupil, I'm mixing ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, and my raw umber paint. So the ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson are the darkest paints I have on my palette, but they do make a very purple dark, so by adding some of this raw umber it just neutralises the chroma of the paint slightly. And as the light paint underneath is still wet, I have to be very direct with my brush strokes in the application of painting this dark paint. I just put the paint down in one direction to avoid mixing the paint with the paint underneath, and it's a bit of a back and forth process as I go in a bit with the dark, and then sometimes I have to change this a bit by painting some of the light paint around it until I get the pupils looking in the right position. Here I'm reworking the coffee flavoured icing on top of the cake, and as I mentioned earlier on that I was painting this at a slight mid-tone, which allows me to paint lighter paint on top, and the moment I paint this lighter paint on top, it gives more form to the swirls on the icing. And in order to create this lighter mix for some of the highlights, the bits which are just raised up a bit higher, I add some more titanium white to my original icing coloured mix. I load my brush with paint so that when I apply the paint, I apply a thicker stroke to sit on top of this layer that I've already painted. I'm also going in with some darker paint as well to paint some of these half tones and to create that spiral pattern of the swirl of the icing. Here I'm adding some more definition to the layers of the cake, and I'm trying to capture that light effect and help give the cake that three-dimensional spherical aspect to it. So as the cake is getting lit from the left hand side of the cake is going to be a bit lighter than the right hand side, and as you can see that the right hand side is casting a shadow, and even though the transition from the left to the right on the layers of cake is very soft and subtle, the right hand side is still in shadow. And in order to create this effect, I'm just adding a lighter mix that I've made on my palette, which is in color temperature, just slightly warmer, and painting this on to the left hand side. Now that I'm in the final stages of the painting, I'm relying a lot more on small brushes. Here I'm using a pointy round synthetic brush from Rosemary & Co.'s Ivory selection. And it's really good because it's got this really fine point, so I can add really small subtle details. And at this stage my focus is really rendering the texture of the cake. So I'm trying to create that sponge cake-like effect to the layers of cake, and also picking up some smaller highlights in certain areas.
So I hope you enjoyed that video of me painting this coffee and walnut cake. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You can also follow me on Instagram at George Frederick Thomas. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.